In a faraway galaxy on a planet where the strong ruled and the weak were cast aside, there lived a woman who was different from everyone else. Her name was Lyra. She had once been a warrior, strong and fierce, feared by enemies, loved by her people. But now she was a prisoner of her own body. Lyra had been paralyzed in an attack that had left her helpless. Her legs no longer carried her, and her once swift hands were bound by the limitations of her physical condition. Despite this, Lyra's mind was still sharp. She could think, plan, and dream. She was still the warrior she had always been, just trapped in a body that no longer worked the way it once did. Her body might have been broken, but her spirit was unyielding. She lived in a small, isolated cabin, far from the bustling cities of her planet. The land around her was cold and unforgiving. Snow covered everything, and the winds howled through the trees like the voices of the forgotten. The silence of the wilderness surrounded her, but Lyra had grown accustomed to it. It was the silence of a broken world, the silence of an empire that had long forgotten about her. Each day she would sit by the window staring out into the snow-covered wilderness. Her eyes would follow the animals that roamed freely, their lives untouched by the cruel fate that had befallen her. She wondered if she would ever know freedom again, if she would ever walk among them, free to live her life as she had before. But despite the quiet, dark thoughts that often clouded her mind, Lyra did not let herself give in to despair. She could still think. She could still plan. And she would never stop fighting. One day, as she sat by the window, she saw something that caught her attention. A figure cloaked in shadows appeared at the edge of the forest. At first she thought it was just her imagination, but then the figure moved closer, and she saw it more clearly. It was a man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and muscular, though his gait was slow as though burdened by something. He dragged a heavy cart behind him, a cart that looked like it had been used for labor. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. This man, whoever he was not from her village. He was from a place far more dangerous, the empire that had taken everything from her. The same empire that had enslaved countless souls, forced them into labor, and broken them until they had no will left to fight. She watched as the man approached her cabin. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mind raced with questions. Who was he? What was he doing here? And most importantly, why was he dragging that cart? Lyra knew that she had to act fast. Despite her condition, she was still a warrior. She had trained for situations like this. She moved as quickly as she could to her weapons, which were hidden under the floorboards. They were old, worn, but they still held the power to defend her. She gripped the hilt of her sword, her fingers trembling from both excitement and fear. She crept to the door and peered out through a small crack. The man was now standing outside, looking around as if unsure of his surroundings. Lyra's eyes narrowed. He was either lost or had been sent on a mission. Either way, he was close, and she was ready. But just as she was about to make her move, something unexpected happened. The man dropped to his knees. His shoulders slumped in defeat. The cart he had been dragging tipped over, spilling out crates of what looked like heavy materials. He didn't seem to have the strength to lift it back up. Lyra's heart softened. She had never been one to show mercy, but there was something about this man that made her hesitate. Was he truly an enemy? Or was he just another victim of the Empire? Like her, without thinking, she slowly opened the door, her weapon still in her hand, but lowered. The man didn't notice her at first, lost in his own thoughts. Then she spoke. "You look like you need help." Lyra's voice was calm, though it carried the weight of her unspoken anger. She could feel the power in her words, the strength that came from being the one who had survived, who had seen the worst and still managed to stay alive. The man turned, startled. His eyes were wild, filled with fear and confusion. When he saw her, his eyes widened even further. You're alive?" he stammered. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in years. Lyra narrowed her eyes. "Of course I'm alive. Why wouldn't I be?" The man stood up slowly, unsure of what to make of her. He looked down at his shackles, then back at her, his expression filled with disbelief. I've heard stories about you, he said quietly, almost to himself. They said you were dead. They said they had broken you. Lyra's heart skipped. The stories he was referring to were the stories of the Empire, stories of how they had conquered and destroyed everything in their path. But she was not dead. She was still here, still fighting, even if it was just with her mind. I'm not dead, she said firmly. And neither are you. You're just trapped, like I was. The man stared at her, confused. Trapped? Lyra nodded. The Empire enslaves us all. It tries to break us, but it doesn't have to succeed. You can still fight. For the first time in what seemed like years, the man looked hopeful. His shoulders relaxed, and he met her gaze with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. He was not the only one who had been broken. They both had been in different ways, but now they were alive, and together they might stand a chance at freedom. The man extended his hand toward her, his eyes full of gratitude and newfound strength. Lyra looked at his hand, then into his eyes, and for the first time in years, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The wind howled outside, a constant reminder of the cold world they were trapped in. Lyra sat in her small cabin, staring out into the swirling snow, her thoughts racing. The strange man she had encountered earlier lingered in her mind. His rugged face and wearied eyes etched into her memory. She had never expected to meet anyone out here, especially someone who had survived the brutal empire. The crackling fire in the corner of the cabin offered little warmth, but it was enough to keep her from freezing in the harsh, lonely nights. Her mind, however, was still frozen with doubt and confusion. What was his purpose here? Was he truly an enemy, or had the Empire driven him to the edge of despair like so many others? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft creaking of the door. She turned, her hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of her sword. The figure from earlier stood in the doorway, hesitating before stepping inside. The man's shoulders were slumped, his hands still bound by the shackles of his past. His clothes were torn, and his face was worn from exhaustion. But his eyes were alive with something Lyra hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. I didn't know where else to go, he said, his voice quiet, unsure. I don't want trouble. I just need a place to rest. Lyra lowered her sword slowly. The man had no weapon, and from the way he stood there, his body language spoke more of defeat than hostility. She could see it in the way his eyes flickered between her and the cold ground, a mixture of fear and curiosity. You don't need to worry about trouble, she said, her voice soft but firm. Come in. It's not safe out there. The man stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The cabin was small, but it had been her sanctuary for years. She had grown used to the solitude, but something about having another person in the room, especially one who seemed to be just as lost as she was, stirred a mixture of discomfort and curiosity in her. Lyra motioned toward the small fire. Sit down, you must be tired. He nodded gratefully and took a seat across from her. His hands were still bound, but he didn't seem to mind. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. They were both survivors, but their lives had been shaped by different kinds of pain. What's your name? Lyra asked after a long pause, breaking the silence. The man looked at her, his eyes weary, yet kind. I'm Kale, he said quietly. And you're Lyra, aren't you? The warrior they thought was dead. Lyra stiffened at the mention of her name. I'm alive, she said simply. There was no point in going into details. The Empire had long believed her to be dead, killed in the battle that had left her paralyzed. But they were wrong. She was still here. Kyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze drifting to the shackles on his wrists. I'm sorry for intruding. I didn't know where to go. I thought maybe you could help me. Lyra raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Help you? What's your story? Kale hesitated for a moment, his fingers absently tugging at the edges of his torn shirt. I was captured by the Empire years ago. They forced me to work in their mines, breaking my back day after day, but something changed. I couldn't stand it anymore, so I escaped. But escaping from them isn't easy. They've been chasing me for days. Lyra's heart ached as she listened to Kale's story. She knew what it was like to be trapped, to be controlled by forces greater than herself. She had spent years living, in isolation, her body broken but her mind still fighting. But Kale, he had been a part of something far worse. He had been enslaved by the Empire, forced into a life of labor and suffering. His freedom had been stolen, and now he was on the run with no place to call home. Lyra couldn't help but feel a strange kinship with him. They were both broken in their own ways. She, physically, and he, emotionally and mentally. But both had survived. Both had fought to stay alive. And now, fate had brought them together. "You said you escaped. Why come here?" Lyra asked, her voice softer now. "This place is far from the Empire's reach. No one comes here." Kyle looked at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I thought maybe you could teach me how to fight back. I don't have anything left. But if there's a chance to bring them down, I need to take it." Lyra stared at him, her mind racing. He wanted her to teach him. She had spent years living in isolation, hiding from the world, nursing her wounds, both physical and emotional. She had no idea what she could offer him. She was just a broken woman, trapped in a body that no longer worked the way it used to. But Kale, he had fire in his eyes, a desire for revenge that she could feel deep in her bones. "You're asking the wrong person," she said, shaking her head. "I'm not a warrior anymore. I can't fight the Empire. I can't even fight for myself." Kyle leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "You survived. You didn't give up. That's more than most can say. If you can survive all of this, then maybe, just maybe, you can help me fight back. We can fight together." Lyra looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation she had felt when she first realized. She had been broken, but now she saw something else too, a spark of hope. She hadn't felt that in so long. It was almost as if by helping him, she could find her own strength again. She didn't know if she was ready to fight, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let him face the Empire alone. With a deep breath, Lyra made a decision. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll help you. But I'm not doing this alone." Kyle nodded, his face lighting up with relief. "Thank you. I won't let you down." And so, their journey together began. Two broken souls, each with their own scars and wounds, but both with the same goal: to bring down the Empire that had torn their lives apart. Lyra had never expected to find an ally in this desolate place. But now, with Kale by her side, the future seemed just a little bit brighter. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for something much bigger: freedom, justice, and a chance at something more. Together they would take the first step toward changing the galaxy forever. And neither of them knew just how far that journey would take them. But one thing was certain: they were in this fight together, and they weren't going to stop until they had won. The days that followed were filled with tension and uncertainty. Lyra and Kale, two broken souls bound by a common goal, began their journey together, a journey that would test their limits and reveal their hidden strengths. They were no longer just survivors. They had become fighters, determined to take back their freedom and challenge the Empire that had enslaved them both in different ways. They knew their mission wouldn't be easy. The Empire had eyes everywhere. They were watching, waiting for any sign of rebellion. The men and women who served the Empire were ruthless, trained to crush anything that stood in their way. Lyra, once a warrior in her prime, had no illusions about the dangers they would face. And Kale, the enslaved man with a past of endless labor and torment, carried the scars of his captivity, both physical and emotional. But neither of them was willing to go back to the lives they had once known. Lyra's body might have been broken, but her mind and spirit were unyielding. Kale had been a slave for far too long, and now the desire for freedom burned deep in his heart. Together, they made a pact. No matter the odds, they would fight. Their first challenge came soon after they left Lyra's cabin. The snow-covered paths were treacherous, and the cold bit into their skin like 1,000 needles. But it wasn't the cold that made Lyra's heart race. It was the shadows lurking at the edges of their journey. The Empire's soldiers were never far behind. They had to stay ahead of them, keep moving, or risk being caught. "We need to find shelter," Lyra said one evening as they huddled together near a fire. "We can't stay out in the open like this for too long." Kyle nodded, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. "There's an old abandoned fortress a few miles from here. I've heard rumors that it's empty. It might be the best place to lay low for a while." Lyra studied Kale's face, trying to read his thoughts. She knew he had been through hell, but there was something about him, a resilience that made him stronger than he seemed. Despite his chains, despite the years of oppression, he had managed to escape, and now he was helping her, leading her forward. "I trust you," she said quietly. "Let's go." They moved quickly, covering the distance between Lyra's cabin and the fortress in a matter of hours. The journey was exhausting, and Kale's energy was starting to flag. He had been through too much to be fully healed, but he wasn't about to give up. Not now. Not when they were so close. When they reached the fortress, they were greeted by an eerie silence. The stone walls loomed high above them, cold and weathered from years of neglect. It was a place forgotten by time, a relic from a past, long gone. But it was perfect for what they needed, an abandoned stronghold where they could regroup and plan their next move. They entered the fortress cautiously, their eyes darting around for any signs of danger. But the place was empty, its halls echoing with their footsteps. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. There was no sign of anyone having been there in years. They set up camp in one of the larger rooms, the fire crackling as they sat, by its warmth. For the first time in days, they could relax. But Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fortress felt too quiet, too still. It was as if the very walls were watching them, waiting for something to happen. "We can't stay here forever," Lyra said after a while, breaking the silence. "The Empire will catch up to us eventually. We need a plan." Kale nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. "I know, but I don't have a plan. I never did. I just wanted to escape, to survive. I didn't think beyond that." Lyra turned to him, her gaze steady. "Survival isn't enough. If we want freedom, we have to fight. We have to take back what was stolen from us." Kyle's eyes darkened. "But how? We don't have an army. We don't have the resources. We're just two people hiding in the shadows." Lyra stood, her face hardening with resolve. "Two people can change the world, Kale. It's not about how many we are, it's about what we're willing to do." She knew that the Empire had never counted her out. They had written her off as broken, a useless relic of a past long gone. But they were wrong. They had underestimated her, and now she was going to prove them wrong. She was going to show them the power of a single person who refused to bow. Kyle watched her, a new light in his eyes. "You really believe we can do this?" Lyra looked at him, her voice firm. "I do. I've fought for everything I've ever had. And I'll fight for this too. We just need to be smart. We can't take on the Empire head on, but we can hit them where it hurts." For the next few days, they worked together, using Lyra's knowledge of tactics and strategy to come up with a plan. They would sabotage the Empire's supply routes, disrupt their communications, and recruit others who were willing to fight. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was enough to show the Empire that the people weren't afraid anymore. But as they made their plans, the Empire was already closing in. Lyra and Kale's movements hadn't gone unnoticed. They had drawn attention, and now the Empire's soldiers were on their way to the fortress. On the fifth night, the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. Lyra and Kale froze, their hearts pounding. The soldiers had arrived. The time to fight had come. They grabbed their weapons, ready to defend their new home. They didn't know if they would survive the coming battle, but they knew one thing. They weren't going to give up without a fight. The Empire had taken everything from them, but they still had one thing left: each other. And that was enough. The struggle for freedom had begun, and no matter what happened next, Lyra and Cale were ready to face it together. They weren't just fighting for their survival anymore. They were fighting for their future, for the future of everyone who had been crushed under the Empire's heel. The battle was only just beginning, and they were ready to make their stand. The sound of marching boots echoed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Lyra and Cale stood side by side, their backs pressed against the cold stone walls of the fortress. Their weapons were drawn, hearts racing, and the weight of what they were about to face settled heavily in their chests. They had come a long way, from two broken individuals with nothing left to lose to a pair of rebels willing to challenge the Empire. But tonight, they were facing their greatest test yet. The Empire's soldiers were closing in. 100 strong. They had tracked their every move, and now they were at the gates of the fortress. Lyra and Cale had expected this moment to come, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. This was the moment that would define everything, the moment that would either bring them victory or destruction. "We can't hold them off forever," Cale said, his voice tense as he looked out over the ramparts, watching the soldiers approach. Lyra's gaze remained steady, her expression determined. "We don't need to hold them off forever. We just need to buy enough time." She knew that they couldn't win by force alone. The Empire was too strong, too vast. But what they had was something the Empire could never take from them, a reason to fight, a purpose that went beyond survival. It was a fight for freedom, for justice, for those who had been silenced by the Empire's cruelty. "I've already sent word to the rebels," Lyra said quietly. "They should be here soon." Kyle looked at her in surprise. "The rebels? You've been in contact with them?" Lyra nodded, a small, confident smile on her lips. "It's time the galaxy knew that we're not going down without a fight." Suddenly, the ground shook as a heavy explosion rocked the fortress walls. The Empire had arrived, and they weren't here for diplomacy. The gates trembled as the soldiers pounded on them, eager to breach the fortress and crush any hope of rebellion before it could spread. "We don't have much time," Kyle said urgently. Lyra turned to him, her voice calm but firm. "We make our stand here. We show them that the people won't be silenced anymore." The soldiers at the gates began to shout, demanding surrender. They had no idea what they were about to face. "Let them come," Lyra said, her voice unwavering. "They'll regret ever underestimating us." They waited in silence as the rumble of boots grew louder, the soldiers' voices growing more desperate. The gates of the fortress rattled, and then, with a deafening crash, they were forced open. The first wave of soldiers poured in, weapons drawn, faces twisted with hate. Lyra and Cale didn't hesitate. They charged forward, using the element of surprise to their advantage. Lyra, despite her paralysis, was no less fierce than she had been in her prime. Her mind was sharp, and she directed Cale, who fought with the ferocity of a man who had nothing left to lose. They fought side by side, a perfect team, Lyra's strategies and Cale's strength blending together seamlessly. The soldiers were taken off guard, their ranks broken by the unexpected resistance. They had expected an easy victory, but what they faced instead was the fury of two people who had been broken by the Empire's cruelty, but had refused to stay down. The battle raged on for hours, the sound of clashing steel and gunfire filling the air. Lyra's arm ached with each swing of her weapon, but she pushed through the pain. Cale, his body covered in bruises and cuts, never stopped moving, his anger fueling his every strike. The Empire's soldiers began to fall back, their morale shattered as they realized that they were not facing a helpless woman and an enslaved man. They were facing a force of will, of defiance. And then, as if fate itself had decided to intervene, the ground shook once again. This time it wasn't the Empire's forces, it was the rebels. A dozen ships descended from the sky, their guns blazing as they obliterated the Empire's forces from above. The soldiers who had once been confident and powerful now found themselves caught in a crossfire they couldn't escape. Lyra and Cale looked up, their hearts swelling with hope. The rebels had arrived just in time, and with their help, the tide of battle shifted in their favor. The Empire's soldiers, now scattered and disorganized, began to retreat. The battle that had seemed like an impossible fight was turning into a resounding victory. But Lyra knew that the victory didn't come from weapons alone. It came from the courage of those who were willing to fight for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. It came from the strength of people like her, broken but unbowed, and Cale, who had once been enslaved but had found the courage to rise against his captors. As the last of the Empire's soldiers fled, Lyra and Cale stood together, their chests heaving with exhaustion but their hearts full of triumph. The Empire had been defeated, at least for now, but the real victory lay in what they had built. They had shown the galaxy that no matter how far the Empire's reach extended, no matter how powerful its forces were, there was always a chance to fight back. There was always a chance to win. "We did it," Kyle said, his voice filled with disbelief. Lyra nodded, a proud smile forming on her lips. "We did." But the battle was far from over. The Empire may have been defeated in this battle, but there were still many more to fight. The road ahead would be long, and they would face many challenges. But now, they had a new dawn. They had hope, and they had each other. As the sun began to rise over the battlefield, Lyra and Cale stood side by side, watching as the first light of day broke through the darkness. The galaxy was changing. The Empire's reign was crumbling and the people were rising. Lyra and Cale had started a revolution, and they weren't going to stop until they had won their freedom for good. The victory was only the beginning. The new dawn had arrived, and with it, the promise of a better future for all. And Lyra knew with every fiber of her being that this was just the start of something much bigger, a movement that would change the galaxy forever. The Empire had underestimated them, and now they would pay the price. The fight for freedom had just begun, and together Lyra and Cale were ready to see it through to the end.